So in today's lesson, we're going to talk about something that I think is particularly important, especially when you're starting off in Magic, because that is when you are the most creative. When you have this lust for learning and this lust for wanting to come up with stuff on your own, what are the problems that could hold you back? And what are some things that you could do yourself to kind of maximize this productivity and maximize your creativity when it comes to coming up with tricks or moves or sleights, or even just trying to be creative overall when presenting tricks themselves? So I have a couple different ways that I approach creativity when it comes to Magic. And one of the first things that you need to realize is that a lot of the things that you might come up with yourself have already been taken or have already been created by other people. So don't let that discourage you. Don't let that think that, oh, you spend time working on a move, you spend time working on a particular idea, and it's already been created by Marlowe in 1949. That doesn't matter. It tells you that you're going the right way. It tells you that you're thinking in the right frame of mind. And also, you're adding your own personal touches to it. There's different things that have affected the way you perform certain sleights, different things that have affected the way you have learned Magic to begin with. So those things are going to affect your creative process. So don't be discouraged by finding out that somebody came up with a particular trick years before you ever thought of the concept. Now, me personally, when it comes to creativity, what I like to do is that I like to set problems for myself. I set a problem on myself so that I could use that to come up with an effect. So to me, personally, the method does not matter. When I set out to create a trick, when I set out to create a move, a sleight, I think of a problem first. So for example, I need a selected card to be moved to a particular number. I need that to happen. How can I do that in the context of a natural move? So I think of different ways to do it. I think of every method possible for that. Now, when that comes to play, when I think of all those particular methods, that's where the limitations come in, because then you could break down whether or not those particular methods that you came up with are in fact practical. Let me give you a perfect example, just with a basic rudimentary effect. So let's say you just want a spectator's card from the middle of the deck to the top of the deck. I know it's a simple problem. It's something that we all have solutions for, but let's think about different methods. So different methods. You could have all the cards be the same card. So imagine you have an entire deck comprised of just the Queen of Hearts. Right? That makes it very easy because you could have the spectator pick any card. They could look at the card. That card could go cleanly in the middle of the deck. You snap your finger and that card comes on top of the deck without any sort of moves on your end. That is one particular method and one that shouldn't be dismissed. But then how do we cover that? Maybe we might have the bottom be a different card so that when we take the deck out of the box, we show this bottom card. It's implied to be a normal deck. So when the spectator takes any card out, this card is different than this card. So therefore, they assume that it's a regular deck. They have no reason to believe otherwise. However, this method isn't practical. So what are other ways we could do this? Well, we could use the double lift, right? That's one way we could use. We could show the Queen of Hearts. We could put that card supposedly in the middle of the deck and show the Queen to have come to the top of the deck. Now, that method isn't anything new. However, it does lead you to start thinking of methods and start thinking of effects. So you start with an effect and you come up with a method to reach that effect. So here we have, with this example, two extremes. We have one method where the entire deck is needed to do this particular trick and the entire deck is a certain way in order to accomplish the actual effect. And we have a method that's based on entirely sleight of hand. So you have different ways to approach the same problem. However, these are still solutions to this problem and shouldn't be dismissed no matter how ridiculous they are. So to me personally, when I'm coming up with stuff, the method does not matter. The method is irrelevant. What matters to me is the effect and how I could accomplish that effect no matter what. Now, going back on what I was talking about previously, limitations are also key because with limitations, that equals practicality. When you set limits, those limits are usually things that add to the practical nature of the effect. So for example, let's say we're talking about that previous effect and we want a card from the top of the deck to be placed very cleanly in the middle, and that card comes on top, right? That's the effect that we're going for. However, the limitation we set on ourselves is that we don't want to use a double lift. And we also don't want to use an entire special deck. We want to be able to do this with any deck, anytime, anywhere. So now we present ourselves with a little bit of problems because we have the limitation that we can't use a double lift, the very common move that's used for this. We also have another limitation in that you can't use a special deck. It has to be a regular deck. So now your brain starts thinking creatively. What are different things you could do to get a card supposedly in the middle of the deck to the top of the deck? Well, we think, okay, now we have to come up with the illusion that we're sticking that card in the middle of the deck. So we have to come up with a method where that card is apparently inserted in the middle of the deck, lost very cleanly, snap of the finger, and it's on top. It's a method that doesn't use a double lift. It's a method that is inherently practical because it uses just an ordinary deck of cards, and yet we still accomplish the same effect, which is that card apparently being placed in the middle and jumps to the top. However, is this method for every context? No, it's not, because this method happens to be very angle sensitive. You're just putting the card on top. That's a simple solution. But you're angling your hand in a way so that card looks like it's going into the middle of the deck. Of course, you snap your finger and that card happens to be on top. But you see here, we found a solution to the problem with the limitations that we have imposed on ourselves. Now, there is one problem with this visual nature of video, and especially these sort of tutorials, in that the method presented sometimes is not going to be the best method for every context. So what I mean by that is that when you see a tutorial online by me or anybody else, oftentimes you're going to perform that with the exact method that's presented. And the honest to God truth is that sometimes that method isn't the best for the particular context that you happen to be in. So if I'm on video and I happen to do a double undercut to get that card to the top, that might not be the best way to solve the problem when you're performing. You might need to do a pass. You might need to do another move. You might need to do some other overt shuffle that controls that card to the top. Just because I use a double undercut in my video doesn't mean that you need to use a double undercut when performing this in person or performing this on video yourself. Don't think that the way that you see something on video is the only way that that should be presented, because oftentimes, and which is the case with a lot of things that I come up with personally, one method could accomplish wildly different effects. So the best example of this is if you watch my memory test video on YouTube, which I'm going to link below. You see that I made a tutorial on Patreon last week of a trick called Palm Reader. You see that those are pretty much using the exact same method. I'm using a spread call to change cards. However, you see that the effects are radically different. So you have one method, which is the exact same, accomplishes two completely different effects. One is one involving memory, and you apparently having the spectator go through a memory test. The other one is you apparently are reading the spectator's palm to figure out which card they picked. Now, of course, the twist is that the cards end up changing. However, the perception of the effect is completely different for the spectator. Think about that, and think about different ways that that could be encompassed for other tricks. So an ambitious card, for example, that could lead itself to other things. You don't necessarily have to have one card coming to the top all the time. That could lead to maybe a different sort of effect. Don't be afraid to just come up with wild effects and try to come up with methods for them. So you want an ambitious card that takes place entirely in the spectator's hand. How do you accomplish that? You have a signed coin, right? The spectator signs a coin. You want that coin to end up in your pocket without any sort of palming. Or you want that coin to end up in the spectator's pocket without any sort of palming or any sort of overt action. How can you do that? Again, the limitation there is you don't want to do any sort of palming. You don't want to do any sort of overt method. And the effect is that you want a signed coin to end up in their pocket. So what are ways to do that? Any card at any number. How do you get a spectator's card at apparently any number? You could very easily use a deck of one card. You could use a deck that is all the same card. However, what's the limitation you set on yourself? You want to do it with a regular, ordinary deck of cards. So how do you do that method? Well, there's dozens of methods to do that. So don't worry about the method. Think about the effect first, then the method will come. You'll come up with dozens of methods for particular tricks. I think one of the most important hints and advice I could give you when trying to think creatively is to not be afraid of failure. That's one thing that makes it difficult for people to step out of their comfort zone and to be afraid of doing certain things for people because they're afraid of failure. They're afraid that their method, they're afraid that whatever it is they came up with, whatever thing they thought up, is not going to work. And I think failure is one of the greatest things that we could possibly have when trying to be creative, because that tells you what works and what doesn't work. To give you an example, I remember I thought of a method of doing Paul Harris's Anything deck. Now, Paul Harris's Anything deck, if you're not familiar with it, you have a deck of cards, spectator names any word. You have a packet of cards that you set aside previously. You use that word that the spectator picked to find a card that they picked. And at the end of the whole thing, the cards on the table spell the word. So let's say the word is rose. You have an R, O, S, and an E on the cards in the table. So I came up with a different way to do that. I've come up with probably a dozen different ways to do that I'm very proud of. However, there was one in particular that involved a prediction and it involved some sort of equivoke and a lot of stuff. I remember I was very proud of the method, and when I performed it for a couple people, they all had the same exact reaction, which is, that's a lot. That was a lot of things happening. So I wasn't aware of this until I failed, until I did the effect for someone and they called me out saying that's a lot of different things. I feel like you were doing this while you were doing this. And in my head before, I thought that the method was solid. I thought the method was bulletproof. It turns out it was the furthest thing from bulletproof. However, it did get me thinking of other methods. It did get me thinking of other ways to present that effect. And I ended up coming up with a way that I'm very, very proud of. So don't be afraid of failure. Failure oftentimes is going to lead to innovation. And that innovation is just going to boost your creativity. So to summarize this video and to give you guys just the best little snippet of what I do to approach creativity and things that should help you out, effect before method. So definitely think of the effect first, and the methods are going to come just to you naturally. Don't be afraid of failure, and think contextually. Don't just see something online and copy it immediately. Think of different ways to present it, because the same method could apply to wildly different effects. So I hope that helped you out a little bit. When it comes to creativity, it's really going to be on a person-to-person basis, and that's just the way I approach creativity. That's just the way that I approach coming up with certain tricks, coming up with certain moves, coming up with certain ideas that later fruit into these full-fledged routines or full-fledged ideas. So I really hope that helped you guys out. Thank you so much again for being part of the Pick K Card Academy, and I hope to see you guys on the next one.